The boardwalk in Ocean Haven stretched nearly a mile along the deserted beach, its weather-worn planks creaking faintly under each step. In the summer, it was alive with families, street performers, and food stalls, but now, deep in October, the place was hollow, a skeleton of its lively self. Kyle jogged along it at twilight, his sneakers slapping against the damp wood. The salty breeze cooled his sweat, and the rhythmic crash of waves seemed to keep pace with his breathing. It was his routine, 3 miles every evening, no matter the season. Yet tonight, the emptiness weighed on him. Every storefront was shuttered, every bench vacant, and every lamppost buzzed faintly with a cold, flickering glow. Halfway down, Kyle slowed, pulling out his water bottle. He fumbled for his house keys tucked into his hoodie pocket, just to check they hadn't slipped out while he ran. To his relief, they were there, but as he turned them over in his hand, the small metal ring snagged on the seam of his pocket. With a slight tug, the keys fell, clattering through a gap in the warped planks of the boardwalk. His heart sank instantly. He crouched down, pressing his face between the slats, straining to see in the dim light. The sound of the keys hitting the sand below had been clear, but it wasn't the only noise. There had been a faint scuffle, something dragging against the grit. At first, he thought it must have been the wind. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the sand beneath the boardwalk wasn't empty. Just beyond the spill of lamplight, a darker shape lingered in the shadows. It shifted slightly, like someone crouched low to the ground. Kyle blinked, leaning in closer, his breath fogging against the cold wood. A hand, pale, thin, and dirt-smudged, slid out from the darkness, curling around his keys. The sound of metal scraping against bone made his stomach drop. Whoever it was didn't return them. Instead, the figure withdrew back into the blackness beneath the boardwalk, keys jingling faintly with each movement. Kyle's chest tightened. Every instinct told him to bolt, but he forced himself to remain still. He muttered a nervous laugh, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was some homeless man living under the structure. Maybe. But even as the thought crossed his mind, the figure's hand returned, empty this time, and dragged along the underside of the planks, right beneath where Kyle was kneeling. The scraping noise was deliberate, slow, and taunting. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering, and backed away several paces. The boardwalk around him seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, the lamps now flickering harder, casting long, wavering shadows. He tried to convince himself to just run home, leave the damn keys. But then a sound cut through the wind, a whistle. High-pitched, airy, almost playful. It came from under the boardwalk. Another answered it, farther down, deeper, guttural. Kyle froze, his mouth dry. There wasn't one person under there. There were at least 2. He didn't wait another second, he bolted, sprinting full speed back down the boardwalk, the sound of his own panicked breath nearly drowning out the soft but unmistakable jingling of his stolen keys following him in the dark. Kyle didn't stop running until the warm glow of his street came into view. His lungs burned, but adrenaline kept his legs moving. He didn't dare look over his shoulder, though the phantom jingling of his keys still echoed in his ears. By the time he reached his small rental house 2 blocks from the shore, he was drenched in sweat, his hoodie clinging to his skin. He slammed the front door shut, double-locked it, and leaned against it, listening to the silence inside. For a moment, he almost laughed at himself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he'd spooked himself for no reason. But as he slid down to the floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still nearby. The night dragged on restlessly. Kyle sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone, replaying what he'd seen beneath the boardwalk. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured that pale hand curling around his keys. He couldn't convince himself it had just been a vagrant. The way the scraping moved directly beneath him, the whistling, it had felt intentional, like a game. By 2 a.m., he had finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. That's when a faint clink startled him awake. It came from his front porch, heart hammering. Kyle crept toward the window, careful not to make the floorboards creak. The street outside was empty, the lone street lamp painting the pavement in a cone of pale orange. For a long moment, he saw nothing. Then his eyes lowered to the porch itself. There, lying neatly on the doormat, was a single item, one of his shoelaces. The same lace he remembered tugging loose during his jog earlier that evening. It hadn't been loose when he got home. Someone had removed it. And someone had brought it back. Kyle's throat went dry. He didn't open the door, didn't touch the shoelace. He backed away slowly, every nerve screaming at him to flee the house altogether. But where could he go? His car keys were on that lost ring. He felt trapped, like the walls of his home were no longer his own. Instead, he spent the rest of the night awake, pacing, flinching at every sound outside. The steady roll of waves crashing against the shore no longer sounded soothing, it sounded like a warning drum. By morning, the shoelace was gone. No sign of it on the doormat, no trace that it had ever been there. Kyle stood at the window, staring at the empty porch with a gnawing dread that only deepened. Whoever had been under the boardwalk hadn't just taken his keys. They knew who he was, where he lived, and worse, they wanted him to know it too. Kyle tried to convince himself the shoelace had been a dream, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But as the day wore on, unease clung to him like damp clothes. Every errand felt risky without his car keys, so he stuck to walking, keeping his eyes low and his pace brisk. The boardwalk loomed in the distance, visible from almost every street in Ocean Haven, its skeleton-like frame stretching across the sand. He avoided looking at it directly, yet his gaze kept drifting there, drawn to the hollow spaces beneath. He could almost imagine figures crouched in the shadows, watching. That evening, he tried to maintain his routine. He told himself he wouldn't go near the boardwalk, but by sunset, he found himself drawn to the beach anyway. Maybe part of him wanted closure, proof that what he saw hadn't been real. The shoreline was empty, the sky streaked orange and gray. The air smelled of seaweed and salt, sharp enough to sting his nose. He hesitated at the base of the wooden stairs that led up to the boardwalk. His skin prickled as if some unseen current ran beneath it, beckoning him upward. Against every instinct, he climbed. The boardwalk was desolate, just as before. The shop stood dark, windows covered in dusty plywood. The planks beneath his shoes groaned, warped with age. Kyle forced himself to walk halfway down, to the place where he'd dropped his keys. Kneeling, he pressed his ear against the gap between the boards. For a moment, there was only the sound of surf. Then, faint and muffled, a voice whispered his name. Kyle. His blood turned to ice as he stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet, but his eyes locked on the shadows beneath. There was no mistaking it this time, he could see movement, shifting shapes pacing just out of view. And then came the sound, the familiar jingle of keys, sharp and deliberate. Panic surged through him. He bolted toward the end of the boardwalk, his sneakers thudding like gunshots. The whisper followed, rising above the waves, calling his name again, closer this time, as if the voice had climbed out from beneath the planks. By the time Kyle reached the sand, his legs were trembling so badly he could hardly stand. He didn't look back, didn't dare. He sprinted toward home, but deep down he knew running wouldn't solve anything. Whoever, or whatever, was beneath the boardwalk wasn't confined to it anymore. It knew him, it had his keys, and it had spoken his name. Kyle didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boardwalk, the shadows stirring beneath, the pale hand curling around his keys. By 3 a.m., he sat upright on the couch, a baseball bat resting across his lap, the blinds drawn tight. The house creaked with its usual noises, pipes settling, the wind pressing against the siding, but each sound carried a sharper edge, like an intruder testing the walls. He kept glancing toward the door, half expecting to see the shoelace returned again, or something worse. Around 3:30, it came. A soft tap against the porch steps. Then another. Slow, measured, like someone deliberately dragging out each footfall. Kyle froze, holding his breath. The footsteps climbed the 3 wooden stairs to his porch. He gripped the bat tighter, his palms slick with sweat. The sound stopped just outside the door. Silence stretched, suffocating, until a faint metallic jingle broke it, the sound of his own keys. Kyle swallowed hard, fighting the urge to shout. He edged toward the window, parting the blinds by a sliver. What he saw made his stomach lurch. At the edge of the porch, illuminated only by the dim street lamp glow, a pair of legs stood motionless. Bare feet, pale and dirty, rested against the wood. He couldn't see the upper half. Whoever it was lingered deliberately out of view of the window. But the keys dangled from one hand, swaying slightly as though mocking him. Before he could react, a whistle pierced the night, the same airy tune he'd heard beneath the boardwalk. It was soft, playful, and it sent chills rushing down his spine. A second whistle answered from somewhere farther down the street. Kyle stumbled backward, heart pounding, realizing there wasn't just one figure outside. There were at least 2, maybe more, circling the block. He snapped the blinds shut, locked every window latch again, and retreated to the center of the living room, the bat clutched to his chest like a lifeline. That he stayed that way until the first pale light of dawn broke through the curtains. When he finally dared to look outside again, the porch was empty. No bare footprints, no shoelace, no keys. But he knew it wasn't over. He knew, with absolute certainty, that whoever had been under the boardwalk wasn't finished with him yet. By the second night without sleep, Kyle's nerves were frayed raw. Coffee did little to keep his eyes open, but every time his lids grew heavy, panic jolted him awake again. He jumped at the scrape of branches against the siding, flinched when the fridge kicked on, and left every light in the house blazing. He tried calling the local police, but with no proof and nothing tangible to report, the officer on the line brushed him off. "Probably just some kids messing with you," the man said. Kyle hung up, staring at the silent phone, feeling more alone than ever. As dusk fell, he swore he heard faint footsteps pacing outside again. He muted the TV and held his breath, waiting. This time, there was no whistle, no keys jingling. Just silence so oppressive it made his ears ring. Then, sharp and sudden, came a knock against the living room window, 3 deliberate taps against the glass. Kyle spun around, bat in hand, but when he pulled back the curtain, nothing was there. The porch light illuminated only empty air. He pressed his forehead against the glass, trying to steady his breathing, when another knock sounded behind him, from the kitchen window. He whipped around. A pale face hovered just beyond the pane, pressed so close the skin looked distorted, stretched wide in a grin too calm, too patient. Kyle stumbled backward, knocking the coffee table askew. The face lingered for only a second before sinking back into the shadows. His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He rushed to the window, but the yard was empty, swaying grass and still night air the only things waiting outside. It was as if the figure had melted into the dark. Kyle slammed the curtains shut, retreating deeper into the house. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped the bat. He checked every lock again, barricading doors with chairs, even pushing a dresser in front of the back exit. Yet he couldn't shake the thought gnawing at his brain: the figures from the boardwalk weren't content with haunting him from a distance anymore. They were testing his walls, finding the seams, reminding him that no barrier was permanent. That night, long after midnight, he heard it again, the whistle. Not from outside this time, but faintly, almost impossibly, from inside the walls themselves. Kyle froze in the middle of his living room, bat raised, listening to the tune echo around him. The realization crashed over him like a wave. He wasn't just being followed. He was being surrounded. Kyle barely recognized himself in the mirror. Hollow eyes stared back, ringed with bruised shadows. His hands shook constantly, whether from exhaustion, fear, or the gallons of coffee he consumed just to stay alert. By now, the house felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. Every corner hummed with silence too heavy to bear. He kept the bat close, sometimes gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. The voices and whistles hadn't returned since last night, but he knew, he felt, they were waiting for him to let his guard slip. That evening, he noticed something strange. A draft, cold and musty, wafted up from the floor of the living room. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but when he crouched low, he could feel it pushing against his face, seeping through the cracks in the warped wooden boards. The memory hit him like a punch, the scraping hand beneath the boardwalk, dragging along the planks. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he pressed his ear to the floor. What he heard drained the blood from his face. A faint shuffle. Then a muffled whisper, his name again, spoken in the same airy voice that had haunted him for days. Kyle. He clapped a hand over his mouth, stifling the cry rising in his throat. The sound wasn't outside, it was beneath him, inside his own house. His chest heaved as he scrambled back, bat raised. For a moment, the floor was silent. Then came the unmistakable metallic jingle of keys, directly under his living room. In a frenzy, Kyle grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice shaking as he begged for help. The dispatcher's calm tone barely registered in his ears. "Stay calm, sir. An officer will be there shortly." But the moment he hung up, another sound joined the keys, the slow, steady thud of something crawling. Boards creaked under the weight, groaning like an old ship at sea. The movement was deliberate, circling beneath him, as though whatever was down there was waiting for the moment he let go of the bat. Then came the knock. Not on a window, not on a door, but against the underside of the floor itself, right where he stood. 3 sharp, deliberate raps that sent vibrations up through his feet. Kyle staggered back, heart pounding, just as the whistle began again, this time rising directly through the cracks in the boards, as if the boardwalk itself had followed him home. Red and blue lights bled across Kyle's curtains 20 minutes later, painting the walls in shifting colors. He'd spent that time crouched in the corner of the living room, clutching the bat so tightly his arms ached, eyes locked on the floor as the whispers and scraping seemed to ebb and flow beneath him. When the knock came at the front door, loud and authoritative, he nearly jumped out of his skin. "Police. Open up." Kyle scrambled to the door, fumbling with the lock before yanking it open. Relief washed over him when he saw the uniformed officer standing on the porch, flashlight in hand. The man was middle-aged, calm but sharp-eyed, his cruiser parked idling at the curb. "You're the one who called about intruders?" he asked. Kyle nodded quickly, words spilling from his mouth as he described everything: the boardwalk, the keys, the whistles, the figures outside, and now the sounds beneath the floor. The officer raised an eyebrow but stepped inside, sweeping his flashlight across the room. "All right, let's check it out." Kyle hovered close, wringing his hands. They both stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the low hum of the fridge. Then, faintly, came the jingle of keys, right beneath the living room. Kyle stiffened, pointing to the floor. The officer frowned, crouched low, and pressed his ear against the boards. His face paled slightly. "Someone's down there," he muttered. He led Kyle outside, around to the crawlspace hatch at the side of the house. With a grunt, the officer yanked it open and shined his flashlight inside. Darkness stared back, thick and endless. He ducked down, crawling partway in, his beam cutting across the dirt. Kyle hovered behind, heart thudding, every muscle tense. "Hello? Police department," the officer barked. The beam shifted deeper, catching on the support beams of the floor above. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then, faintly, something moved. The officer froze. His light caught a pale arm stretched out just beyond reach, fingers wrapped around a ring of keys that gleamed in the beam. The jingling began again, slow and deliberate. Kyle's stomach dropped. "Back up," the officer hissed, his voice low but urgent. He began to crawl backward, flashlight trembling in his hand. But before he could retreat fully, a whistle floated out of the darkness, airy and playful, answered a second later by another one from the opposite end of the crawlspace. There was more than one down there. The officer cursed under his breath, backing out fast, and slammed the hatch shut. Kyle's relief lasted only seconds before he realized the jingling hadn't stopped. It was louder now, echoing through the very walls of his house, as though the intruders weren't beneath him anymore, they were inside. The officer slammed the crawlspace hatch shut, muttering under his breath as he stood, brushing dirt from his knees. His composure had cracked. Kyle could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his flashlight beam wavered just slightly. Lock every door, every window. Stay inside until backup arrives, he ordered firmly, though his voice carried a tremor he tried to hide. Kyle nodded quickly, clutching the bat as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The officer stepped back into the house with him, shutting the front door tight behind them. For a while, silence pressed down. Kyle paced in the living room while the officer spoke quietly into his radio, requesting immediate assistance. The reply came garbled, distorted by static, though the dispatcher's voice seemed wrong. Higher, airier, almost sing-song in tone. Kyle froze, watching the officer's expression twist. Dispatch? Say again, the officer repeated. The reply came clearer this time, a whisper that wasn't a voice at all, but a whistle. The same playful tune Kyle had heard beneath the boardwalk. The officer's face drained of color. He dropped the radio, swore under his breath, and drew his gun. Kyle's knees felt weak, his whole body shivering. Before either of them could speak, every light in the house flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the rooms into darkness. The only illumination came from the officer's flashlight beam, slicing a trembling path through the pitch black. The house seemed to exhale around them, wood creaking as though under some immense pressure. Then came the sound, footsteps, dozens of them, padding across the floors and walls as though the house itself was filled. From the kitchen window, a pale face pressed against the glass again, grinning wide. Another appeared at the back door, fingertips tapping softly on the pane. Keys jingled from the hallway, echoing toward them though no figure stood in sight. Kyle backed into the officer, his voice cracking as he whispered, "They're inside." The whistle started again, louder this time, filling every room, rising in pitch until it became a shrill, ear-splitting chorus. The officer raised his gun toward the hallway, shouting, "Show yourselves." The beam of his flashlight caught something moving, long limbs crawling along the wall, too fast to follow. Then, from the shadows, came the unmistakable sound of Kyle's front door unlocking, the latch clicking open as if by his own stolen keys. The officer steadied his gun on the hallway as the front door latch clicked. For a single heartbeat, silence returned, then the door swung open on its own, hinges shrieking. Cold night air rushed inside, carrying with it the faint smell of salt and rotting seaweed. Kyle clutched the bat so hard his wrists ached, backing toward the living room wall. In the flashlight beam, something crawled across the threshold, low, pale, its limbs bending wrong. The officer shouted a warning, but the figure only paused, tilting its head in an almost curious motion. Then, without hesitation, the officer fired. The gunshot cracked through the house, deafening in the dark. The figure collapsed, but only for a second. The body convulsed, limbs twitching before it pulled itself upright again, impossibly fast. The whistle began anew, louder than ever, as more shapes poured through the doorway. Keys jingled, dozens of them, as if every figure carried a stolen set. Their faces gleamed in the flashlight beam, all stretched with the same wide, patient grin. Kyle screamed, swinging the bat wildly as another figure slammed against the living room window, shattering the glass. Pale hands clawed through the opening, dragging themselves inside. The officer backed toward the kitchen, firing again and again, but the bullets seemed to do little more than stagger the intruders. They kept coming, crawling along the walls, slipping through every gap in the house, their movements jerky and insect-like. The sound of wood splintering filled the rooms as more forced their way in through the crawlspace below. The house was alive with chaos now, glass breaking, floorboards buckling, the chorus of whistles rising higher and higher until it was almost unbearable. Kyle's vision blurred, panic flooding him as he swung until his arms burned, striking one figure in the jaw with a sickening crack. The grin never faltered, not even when the head snapped sideways from the blow. Keys jingled inches from his ear as another figure lunged from the hallway, knocking him to the ground. Pinned beneath its weight, Kyle stared into its hollow eyes. The grin widened, and from its mouth spilled a voice, his own voice, whispering his name. Kyle. His scream was drowned out by the shrill chorus surrounding him, dozens of voices and whistles blending into a cacophony as the intruders finally flooded the house. The house was chaos, splintered wood, shattered glass, shrill whistles cutting through the air. Kyle thrashed beneath the intruder, pinning him, his lungs straining for breath. Then, as if struck by instinct, he twisted free, slamming the bat into the figure's temple. For the first time, it stayed down. He didn't wait to question why. He bolted for the door, ignoring the officer's shouts, ignoring the swarm that filled every corner of his home. He ran into the night barefoot, the cold sand cutting his soles raw as he tore toward the shoreline. The boardwalk rose ahead like a skeletal monument, its planks glowing faintly under the fractured moonlight. Behind him, the jingling of keys followed, dozens of them, rattling like bells in the wind. Kyle's chest burned as he stumbled up the steps, sprinting to the center of the structure. The planks groaned under his weight, each step echoing in the emptiness. He didn't know why he had come here, only that every instinct screamed this was where it had begun, and where it had to end. He stopped halfway down, the same spot where his keys had first fallen. The night pressed close, the ocean roaring beneath. The intruders gathered at the edge of the boardwalk, their pale bodies swaying, faces turned upward with their patient grins. The jingling stopped. The whistling faded. Silence fell, heavier than any noise. Kyle dropped the bat, chest heaving, and shouted into the dark, "What do you want from me?" For the first time, one of them answered. A figure crawled from beneath the slats, rising slowly until its face was inches from his. In the moonlight, Kyle saw his own reflection staring back, hollow-eyed, grinning, whispering his name in his own voice. Kyle. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose plank. The wood gave way with a sharp crack, and before he could catch himself, he fell through the gap into the darkness below. The ocean swallowed him in an instant. Saltwater filled his mouth and nose, dragging him down as pale shapes moved in the water around him, hands brushing against his skin. The last thing he saw before the waves closed over him was the boardwalk above, lined with dozens of figures watching silently, their keys jingling faintly in the wind. By morning, the house was empty, the officer gone, and Kyle's door left wide open, its lock undone, as if it had never needed a key at all.